June 6, 1944. 156,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in a single day. They came in waves. They waded through blood and seawater. They climbed over the bodies of the men who fell before them. It was the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare, and every single bullet, every gallon of gasoline, every field ration, every pair of boots, every crate of ammunition that reached those beaches, and every supply that would need to keep flowing for the next 11 months straight, was the responsibility of one man. Not Eisenhower, not Patton, not Bradley. A man most people have never heard of. His name was Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee. And if you have never heard that name before, that tells you everything you need to know about how history treats the men who win wars from the shadows. Today, we are going to change that. Let's start at the beginning. August 1, 1887. John Clifford Hodges Lee is born in Junction City, Kansas. From a very young age, he knew exactly who he was and where he was going. As a boy, he visited the United States Military Academy at West Point, took one look around, and decided that was his future. He got in. He graduated with the class of 1909, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. Now here is a detail that matters. Sitting in the same graduating class of 1909 was a certain George S. Patton. That is right, Lee and Patton were classmates at West Point. They knew each other from the very beginning, and that history would make their later conflicts all the more bitter and personal. After West Point, Lee spent the next decade doing what Army engineers do, building things, managing waterways, overseeing construction projects across the Panama Canal Zone, Guam, the Philippines, and up and down the rivers of the American interior. He was disciplined. He was meticulous. He was relentlessly productive. He was also deeply, almost ferociously religious. He carried a Bible with him everywhere. He attended church daily and twice on Sundays. He believed with total conviction that he was doing the Lord's work, on every project, in every posting, in every decision he ever made. That faith gave John Lee an iron confidence that could border on arrogance, and it was going to make him a lot of enemies. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Lee went to France. He served as aide-de-camp to Major General Leonard Wood, and later as Chief of Staff of the 89th Infantry Division. He was still a major in the regular army when his temporary wartime rank elevated him to colonel, making him the youngest division chief of staff in the entire American Expeditionary Forces. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, Lee had earned the Silver Star, the Army Distinguished Service Medal, and the Croix de Guerre from the French government. He came home a decorated officer with a rare combination of skills, combat experience, staff expertise, and an engineer's mastery of large-scale logistics. He went back to the Philippines. He managed flood control on the Mississippi. He graduated from the Army War College in 1932. By 1938, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and colonel in rapid succession. By 1940, he was a brigadier general overseeing the San Francisco port of embarkation, the Army's main West Coast shipping hub. This was a man who had spent 40 years learning exactly one thing with extraordinary depth: how to move massive amounts of material from one place to another efficiently, safely, and without stopping. And when World War II arrived, that skill was about to become the most important capability in the entire Allied war effort. May 1942. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall was facing a problem. The United States had decided that the path to defeating Nazi Germany ran through Western Europe, through France, through a cross-channel invasion from England. That meant building up an enormous base of troops and supplies on British soil before any invasion could even begin. Someone had to organize that build-up from scratch. Someone had to be the architect of the entire logistical backbone of the war in Europe. Marshall chose Lee. He was promoted to Major General and ordered to London to take command of what was being called the Services of Supply, the SOS. His mission was staggering in its scope. He had to acquire, pack, ship across the Atlantic, receive, organize, store, and distribute hundreds of thousands of different categories of supplies to an army that would eventually number close to 3 million men. Food, fuel, weapons, medicine, vehicles, clothing, engineering equipment, communication gear, the list was essentially endless. Think about that for a moment. One regiment of combat troops alone could require up to 50 different types of ammunition. Now multiply that need across dozens of divisions spread across an entire continent, all moving, all fighting, all consuming supplies at a ferocious rate every single day. Lee got to work. He set up his headquarters in Cheltenham, England, and began the monumental task of building what amounted to a second army, a logistics army that would shadow and feed the fighting army every step of the way. He organized base sections across Britain. He established supply depots, repair facilities, hospitals, and communication lines. He wrangled with the British over port access. He pushed his staff around the clock. By the time D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, Lee's organization had transferred 37 million tons of material from the United States and Canada to the United Kingdom. 37 million tons. And 1 out of every 4 American soldiers in Europe was under Lee's direct command, not Eisenhower's, not Patton's, Lee's. The man was running a logistical empire, unlike anything the world had ever seen. But here is where the story gets complicated, because John C. H. Lee was not just a capable officer. He was also, by nearly every account from people who worked alongside him, one of the most difficult, grating, pompous, and infuriating personalities in the entire war. Let's talk about the nickname first. Behind his back, soldiers and officers up and down the chain of command called him Jesus Christ himself. Not as a compliment. They took his initials, JCH, and turned them into a joke that captured everything they found insufferable about him. The man referred to himself in his own written memoirs using the royal we. He had his own personal train assigned to him, a beautifully furnished private rail car with a conference room, a dining car, a car for his staff, and flat cars for his vehicles. Eisenhower never had a personal train. Lee insisted on one until he got it. He hobnobbed with British aristocrats and adopted their mannerisms. He had Sam Goldwyn's former Hollywood press agent personally assigned to track his doings and make sure the world knew about them. He expected elaborate shows of deference from everyone around him. He walked into rooms like he owned them, which, in terms of the supply chain, he essentially did. General Omar Bradley called it an unfortunate pomposity. That was Bradley being polite. George Patton was not polite. After spending time with Lee, Patton privately described him as a pompous self-promoter interested only in his own reputation. Patton called him a glib liar. High praise from a man who once slapped a hospitalized soldier and nearly ended his own career. But there you have it. Eisenhower compared Lee to Oliver Cromwell, the 17th-century English military commander famous for his iron will, his religious conviction, and his complete inability to work alongside people who disagreed with him. And then Eisenhower added a line that tells you everything about how complicated this relationship was. He said that Lee's unyielding methods might be vital to success in an activity where an iron hand is always mandatory. In other words, Eisenhower hated working with the man, and Eisenhower also understood that he could not win the war without him. There is one physical detail about Lee that perfectly captures his personality, and historians keep coming back to it because it is simply too vivid to ignore. When he was promoted to lieutenant general and earned his 3rd star, most generals placed their rank insignia on their collars and their caps. John Lee painted 3 stars on the front of his helmet. Then he turned the helmet around and painted 3 more stars on the back. He was the only American general in World War II to wear stars on both sides of his helmet. 6 stars total. Because John C. H. Lee wanted everyone in front of him and behind him to know exactly who he was at all times. There is no better summary of this man's character than that single detail. Now let's talk about what made the Eisenhower feud genuinely explosive. September 1944. The Allied armies were racing across France at breathtaking speed. After the breakout at Normandy, Patton's Third Army in particular was tearing eastward faster than anyone had planned. The supply system was being pushed to its absolute limit. Fuel was running so short that Patton's tanks were literally being stopped in their tracks. The famous Red Ball Express, a convoy system of trucks running around the clock on dedicated roads, rushing supplies to the front, had been improvised by Lee's command as an emergency measure, and it was barely keeping up. Paris had been liberated on August 25, 1944. Eisenhower had been explicit. He did not want major Allied headquarters located in Paris. The hotels and facilities of the city were to be reserved for combat troops on leave, men who had been fighting and bleeding since June and who deserved some rest. Moving a giant headquarters to Paris would consume enormous resources, tie up transportation, and send entirely the wrong message. John Lee moved his headquarters to Paris anyway. He moved 8,000 officers and 21,000 enlisted men, nearly 30,000 people in total, out of England and out of their camps in France and into Paris. He took over the finest hotels in the city. He established his own residence in luxury accommodations. And he did all of this at the exact moment when the supply crisis threatening to halt the Allied advance was at its most critical. Trucks that should have been running fuel to Patton's tanks were instead shuttling Lee's staff into Parisian hotels. Eisenhower was furious. He protested. He complained bitterly. He documented his objection for the record. And then he did nothing. He did not relieve Lee. He did not reverse the move, because Eisenhower understood something that his anger could not erase. Lee was the only man who had the institutional knowledge, the relationships, and the organizational command over the entire supply apparatus to keep the war running. Firing Lee in the middle of the campaign would have been like ripping the engine out of a moving car. The car would stop. Soldiers would die. So Eisenhower tolerated him. He complained about him in private. He worked around him. He quietly lobbied to have Lee removed after the war ended. But in the moment when it mattered most, he kept Lee in place. That is the definition of indispensable. The Patton feud ran on its own separate track, and it was every bit as bitter. George Patton needed fuel the way most people need air. His entire theory of war was built on speed, keep moving, hit hard, never stop, never give the enemy time to recover. And to keep moving, his tanks needed gasoline. Thousands of gallons of gasoline every single day. Lee controlled the gasoline. When the supply situation grew critical in the late summer of 1944, and fuel had to be rationed across the Allied armies, Lee's organization was responsible for deciding who got what. Patton believed, and said so loudly and repeatedly, that his Third Army was being shortchanged, that the fuel was going to the wrong places, that Lee's personal vanity and bureaucratic empire building were costing the Allies the chance to end the war in 1944. There is a school of historical thought that agrees with Patton. Some historians have argued that if Patton had received unrestricted fuel in September 1944, his Third Army could have driven straight into Germany before the Germans had time to regroup, potentially ending the war months earlier and sparing thousands of lives. Lee's defenders counter that the supply system simply did not have the capacity, regardless of who was in charge, that Patton's armored advance had outrun the physical limits of what any logistics system could deliver, that blaming Lee for a structural problem was convenient but unfair. What is not in dispute is the personal contempt between the two men. Patton, the flamboyant combat general who craved glory. Lee, the logistics emperor who craved deference. Two enormous personalities, locked in a power struggle over the lifeblood of the war. They were classmates who had become rivals, and neither man had any interest in backing down. But there is one chapter of John C. H. Lee's story that gets far too little attention. One decision he made in the winter of 1944 that puts him in an entirely different light, and that connects his story to a much larger American story. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had just begun. The Germans had launched their massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies completely off guard and tearing a dangerous bulge in the Allied front lines. American casualties were mounting rapidly. The Army was facing a serious manpower crisis. Frontline combat units were running dangerously short of infantry. Lee looked around at his command, the millions of men under his authority who were doing supply work, moving boxes, driving trucks, unloading ships, and he saw tens of thousands of black American soldiers. Men who had been assigned to the supply branch largely because the segregated United States Army had decided they were not fit for combat. Men who were being denied the right to fight for their own country. Lee issued a call for volunteers. He offered black soldiers under his command the chance to transfer to combat units and fight on the front lines. His original vision was for integrated units, black soldiers fighting side by side with white soldiers, which was a radical idea beyond almost any measure in the America of 1944. Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, pushed back hard. Full integration was not going to happen, but Lee refused to drop the idea entirely. A compromise was eventually reached. Black volunteers would be formed into segregated rifle platoons, but those platoons would serve alongside white units in actual combat. By March 1, 1945, 37 African-American rifle platoons had been formed from Lee's supply troops and sent to the front lines. Thousands of men who had been told their entire lives that they were not good enough to fight chose to give up their safe, warm supply jobs and go into combat anyway, to prove a point, to serve their country, and to answer the call that Lee had made. The performance of those platoons was excellent. The morale was remarkable. And while the United States military would not officially desegregate until President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, Lee's action in December 1944 is now recognized by a number of historians as one of the most meaningful steps toward that moment. He did not end segregation, but he pushed the door open, and thousands of black soldiers walked through it with their heads held high. That is a part of John Lee's legacy that history has almost entirely forgotten, and it deserves to be remembered. Meanwhile, in those final months of the war, Lee was also proving his operational value in a way that Eisenhower would barely acknowledge in public. When the German offensive in the Ardennes exploded in December 1944, the Germans desperately needed two things to sustain it: fuel and ammunition. Lee recognized this immediately. He organized a massive emergency effort to move Allied fuel stockpiles and ammunition dumps out of the path of the German advance, and to destroy anything that could not be moved in time rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. The German offensive, which had initially stunned the Allied command and threatened to break through all the way to the critical port of Antwerp, began to stall. Their tanks ran dry. Their supply lines buckled. Part of the reason was the heroic resistance of American soldiers on the ground, at Bastogne and elsewhere. And part of the reason was that Lee had denied the Germans the fuel they desperately needed by moving or destroying supplies ahead of their advance. Lee received a routine commendation from Eisenhower for this effort. Not a celebration, not a ceremony, a routine commendation, the military equivalent of a form letter. The man who helped strangle the last great German offensive of World War II was given a bureaucratic thank-you note. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. By the time the guns finally fell silent, Lee's command had delivered 41 million tons of material from North America to the fighting fronts across Europe. They had managed between 700,000 and 1 million separate categories of supplies. They had fed, clothed, armed, and fueled an army of close to 3 million men across an entire continent for nearly a year of continuous, grinding, murderous combat. And the moment the victory came, the men who despised John Lee began the process of writing him out of the story. Patton was lionized. Movies were made about him. He became the enduring symbol of American military aggression and brilliance. Eisenhower became President of the United States twice. Bradley became a five-star general, the Army's last general of the Army in American history. Their names are on schools, ships, and monuments across the country. Lee retired in late 1947 after more than 39 years of active service. He died on August 30, 1958, just 29 days after his 71st birthday. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. There is no movie about John Lee. There are no schools named for him. Most people who study World War II casually have never heard his name. So how do we judge this man? He was difficult, genuinely, profoundly difficult. The pomposity was real. The personal train was real. The luxury hotels in liberated Paris were real. The move that infuriated Eisenhower at the worst possible moment was real. He made enemies at a rate that would exhaust a lesser man, and he seemed almost to enjoy it. He was vain in ways that made even Patton shake his head. But he was also the man who built the logistical backbone that made D-Day possible in the first place. He was the man who moved 37 million tons of material across the Atlantic before the first soldier ever set foot on Normandy beach. He was the man who improvised the Red Ball Express when the supply system threatened to collapse under the weight of the Allied advance. He was the man who denied the Germans the fuel they needed during the Battle of the Bulge and helped stop the last great German offensive of World War II. And he was the man who opened the door to combat service for black soldiers 2 full years before President Truman officially desegregated the military. He did all of this while being despised by nearly every senior general he worked alongside, while being undermined, resented, and quietly lobbied against at every turn, while receiving almost none of the public credit that his contributions plainly deserved. There is a saying in military circles: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. The idea is that everyone wants to discuss the grand moves on the map, the flanking maneuvers, the bold advances, the brilliant tactical decisions that change the direction of a battle. But wars are actually won by the men who figure out how to get the bullets and the beans to the right soldiers at the right time. Patton could not have moved without Lee's fuel. Eisenhower could not have launched D-Day without Lee's 2 years of stockpiling. The entire Allied campaign in Western Europe was built on a foundation that one difficult, pompous, deeply religious Kansas engineer spent 3 years laying, brick by brick, shipload by shipload, depot by depot. And when the victory finally came, when the speeches were made and the medals were pinned and the photographs were taken, John C. H. Lee was somewhere in the background. Stars on the front of his helmet, stars on the back, watching the celebration of a war he had helped win from a position that history would almost entirely forget. That is the story of the most powerful general you have never heard of. And now you have heard of him.